If you see yourself in the woods, run. This is the reason I'll never take my son camping again. Jake, my 11-year-old son, blindsided me one day when he asked if we can go camping. I nearly spit out my lukewarm coffee in surprise. This was coming from the same kid who complained about the sun's brightness at soccer practice and whined about mosquitoes at night. So when he suddenly expressed interest in camping, I couldn't help but chuckle. It was such a far cry from his usual pastime of being glued to anything with a screen. We were hanging out by my truck one morning, talking about school, when Jake first mentioned camping. He nudged a pebble along the dry road, his gaze fixed on the ground. "Hey, Dad," he began hesitantly. "Think we could go camping sometime?" I couldn't help but grin from ear to ear. Apparently, Jake's friend Daniel had been endlessly bragging about a camping trip he went on with his dad, making the great outdoors suddenly irresistible to my screen-obsessed son. "Camping, huh?" I said, trying to contain my excitement. "Sounds great, but, it's not all fireflies and s'mores. There's bugs, for one thing. Lots of them." Jake grimaced, his enthusiasm briefly dimming. "Yeah, I know," he mumbled, kicking at the dirt with his sneakers. I gave him a playful nudge. "If the weather holds, maybe we can find a good spot by the lake next weekend. Just you and me. You up for it?" "Yeah," Jake said, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. His response to the lake idea didn't seem genuine. A subtle shrug and a glimmer of disappointment in his eyes revealed his desire for a more immersive experience, one that involved tents, campfires, and a genuine escape into nature. Merely visiting the lake wouldn't cut it. Only a true camping trip would satisfy him. Truth be told, I hadn't been camping in years. Fond memories of childhood fishing trips and backyard campouts with my own dad felt like a lifetime ago. Work had a way of taking over, and lately, it had been consuming more than its fair share. But after listening to Jake's retelling of Daniel's camping trip story, it had stirred something in me, a friendly rivalry. I was suddenly determined to one-up Daniel and his dad, to make sure my boy had the camping trip of a lifetime. A grin spread wide across my face as I promised Jake, "Yeah, you know what, Jake? We're gonna go camping, and it's gonna be the best camping trip ever. As soon as I can take a break from work, we'll go." Jake's excitement was contagious. He jumped up and down with joy, and I couldn't help but laugh. It hit me then that I probably should have introduced him to camping sooner. "Thank you, Dad!" he shouted, his voice ringing with gratitude. "Thank you, Dad! Thank you!" I gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "All right, champ, let's simmer down a bit," I chuckled. "Head inside and get started on your homework. We don't want Mom holding this over our heads," I added with a wink. Jake nodded eagerly and practically skipped into the house, leaving me with a warm sense of fatherly pride. The weeks flew by, and I finally managed to snag some time off work. In the evenings, I'd pore over articles and videos on wilderness survival and the delicate art of s'more making. My childhood camping memories were more fuzzy nostalgia than concrete know-how, and I couldn't let my lack of experience show, not in front of Jake, and certainly not in front of that Daniel. Meanwhile, my ever-supportive wife, Sarah, decided to forego the mosquitoes and campfire smoke for the comfort of our home. She said it was girl time, with a good book and a long bath, but I couldn't help but sense a hint of amusement in her eyes. "Traitor," I'd jokingly tease, reminding her of our grand mission to outshine Daniel on his dad's camping trip. She'd just laugh and say, "Go conquer the wilderness, honey. I'll be here, holding down the fort." It was true that Sarah wasn't exactly an outdoors enthusiast. She enjoyed a leisurely stroll in the park, but multi-day camping trips weren't her cup of tea. Still, I knew she secretly loved seeing Jake and me bond. And deep down, I hoped this man versus wild adventure might reignite my own forgotten love for the outdoors. My mission? Mastering the art of building a fire that wouldn't leave us all choking on smoke. Identifying constellations for Jake, hoping I wouldn't mix up Orion with the Big Dipper, and maybe even catching a fish or two. Although, based on my past fishing experiences, that might be the biggest challenge of all. It was time to put my crash course in wilderness survival to the test and create an unforgettable camping trip for Jake, one that even Daniel and his dad couldn't top. At last, the weekend we'd been waiting for arrived. That Friday, as I picked Jake up from school, excitement buzzed through the car as we pulled into the driveway. The moment we stepped through the front door, Jake's eyes widened in amazement at the sight of the camping gear I had meticulously, or so I thought, laid out for him like a treasure trove for an intrepid explorer. The living room had transformed into a chaotic staging ground for our trip. A giant green tent bag rested at his feet, while two mismatched sleeping bags, one a vivid orange, the other in subdued camouflage, leaned precariously against the table. Beside two overstuffed backpacks, I'd proudly displayed a bounty of rations, mostly marshmallows, chocolate bars, and enough instant ramen to feed a small army. "Ready to conquer the wild with me?" I asked. Jake didn't disappoint. His eyes sparkled with an unspoken thrill that seemed to shout, "I can't wait to tell Daniel I went camping too." With the car packed to the brim and threatening to keel over at any sharp turn, Sarah pulled me aside just before we left. Her usual bright and playful eyes held a seriousness that cut through my usual humor. "Please, be careful out there," she said, her voice tinged with worry. I knew this wasn't the moment for jokes. Squeezing her hand, I gave her a reassuring nod. "We'll be fine," I promised, hoping my confident smile would hide any lingering anxieties about my own lack of camping expertise. Jake and I settled into the car, the engine rumbling with the promise of adventure, determined to make Daniel and his dad's Crystal Lake camping trip look like a backyard picnic. I'd scoured maps and forums for the perfect spot. Jake had mentioned that Daniel and his father had gone camping at the Crystal Lake campgrounds, conveniently close to our town. "Crystal Lake?" I teased, as if it were the last place any self-respecting outdoorsman would pitch a tent. "We're going somewhere way better," I added with a wink. Our destination was at Whisperwood Forest, a hidden camping ground 3 hours north. As the miles stretched before us, Jake peppered me with questions, his enthusiasm keeping the energy high. "Are there bears in Whisperwood?" he asked, eyes wide with a mix of fear and excitement. "Maybe," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant, though a flicker of unease ran through me. The forums did mention some black bear sightings, but that's why we have all this camping gear, right? To be prepared for anything. Jake's questions ranged from the practical, "Will there be a bathroom?" to the fantastical, "Do you think we'll see Bigfoot?" By the time the landscape outside our window blurred into a patchwork of greens and browns, his voice had grown hoarse, and a peaceful silence settled over the car. We veered off the main road, following the rhythm of a narrow dirt path snaking through the dense forest. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy overhead, casting long, dancing shadows on the dusty track. The air hung heavy, with the earthy scent of damp moss and decaying leaves, punctuated by the occasional chirp of an unseen bird. With every bend and dip, the car swayed alongside us, its tires crunching on loose gravel. I caught a glimpse of Jake in the rearview mirror, his head bobbing with every bump, his eyes wide with anticipation and fixed on the passing scenery. After about 20 minutes, we emerged into a small clearing, the sudden brightness of unfiltered sunlight momentarily blinding me. As my eyes adjusted, I took in the scene. The clearing was modest in size, about the size of a tennis court. In its center stood a gnarled oak, its branches reaching out like skeletal arms. An eerie silence enveloped the area, interrupted only by the rustle of leaves in the still air. I brought the car to a gentle stop, the engine sighing softly as it died. Jake's eyes sparkled with anticipation as he looked over at me. "Ready?" I asked, my voice echoing in the sudden stillness. His nod was eager and swift. As I stepped out, my joints popped like distant firecrackers. I retrieved our backpacks from the trunk and hoisted the tent onto my shoulder, its weight familiar and grounding. I let Jake take the lead as we scouted for a camping spot. I knew it was important for him to feel like the captain of our adventure, the leader of our expedition. Watching his determined strides and furrowed brow as he surveyed the land like a seasoned explorer was hilarious. Eventually, we found the suitable spot, or rather, my son did, tucked away from the car and hidden by a thick underbrush. Sunlight danced through the leaves, casting dappled patterns on a carpet of moss and ferns. Nearby, a crystal-clear stream burbled, its melody harmonizing with the chirping symphony of unseen insects. It was a secluded paradise, the perfect refuge for me and my son, nestled away from the world within the forest's embrace. With a proud grin, Jake declared our campsite found. While we scampered off to explore the nearby stream, I tackled the seemingly straightforward task of pitching the tent. However, the instructions were akin to cryptic hieroglyphs, filled with diagrams resembling abstract art and terminology that would challenge even a seasoned scholar. 20 minutes later, after much head-scratching and muttered curses, the tent stood, albeit with a noticeable lean to one side. "Behold!" I announced, trying to hide the beads of sweat gathering on my forehead. Jake, ever the diplomat, simply grinned. "Coolest tent ever, Dad." As we unrolled our sleeping bags inside the tent, I sent Jake on a mission to gather sticks for our fire. He scampered off into the undergrowth while I patrolled the edge of the woods, collecting stray logs to bolster our firewood stash. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw a figure peeking from behind a tree, but dismissed it as a trick of the fading light. Igniting a fire, often portrayed in movies with a single dramatic swipe of a flint, turned into a comedic ballet of fumbled matches and stubborn kindling. My attempts at channeling my inner caveman were met with sputtering defiance from the damp sticks. After 20 minutes of frustration, I surrendered to the ease of modern technology and pulled a lighter from my backpack. As if sensing my defeat, a fire roared to life with a satisfying crackle. I called Jake back, and together we roasted marshmallows under the shifting hues of the evening sky. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky with fiery shades of orange and red, we shared stories and laughter, leaving behind the worries of city life for the simple joy of being together in the wild. As the clock neared 9 p.m., exhaustion settled over us like a warm blanket. Jake, his eyelids drooping like weighted curtains, readily agreed it was bedtime. I subdued the fire with a few nudges from my boot, but instead of fading completely, the embers seemed to pulse like an unnatural inner light, casting dancing shadows across the forest floor. The unusual nighttime sounds of crickets and rustling leaves took an unsettling tone. A distant howl pierced the silence, long and mournful, similar to an owl's call, yet somehow different from any I'd heard before. A chill ran down my spine, prompting me to pull Jake closer and tuck him snugly into his sleeping bag. "It's just an owl, champ," I reassured him, trying to sound confident despite my unease. My voice echoed strangely inside the tent, adding to the eerie atmosphere. But Jake, already drifting off to sleep, remained unfazed. Before I knew it, my eyes had closed, and I drifted off. It felt like no time had passed before a soft nudge at my shoulder stirred me awake. Squinting in the dark, I made out Jake sitting bolt upright, looking at me. "What's wrong?" I mumbled, my voice heavy with sleep. "Shh," he whispered, his voice trembling. There's something outside." Half asleep, I assured him it was probably just a squirrel or a similar creature and encouraged him to try and sleep. I turned onto my side, seeking the comforting embrace of sleep once more. But before it could claim me again, I heard it. A sequence of sounds distinct from the forest's usual symphony. Footsteps, deliberate and measured footsteps, circled our tent. These weren't the light steps of a deer or the clumsy thudding of a bear. There was no natural rhythm to them. No telltale snap of a twig. They were silent, calculated movements. 2 steps, a pause. 2 more steps, a pause. As if whatever lurked outside was deliberately trying to be quiet. 2 minutes stretched into an eternity before the pattern resumed. 2 deliberate steps, a pause, and then 2 more steps. Wiping the sleep from my eyes, I propped myself up. A glance at Jake confirmed he was still awake, his eyes wide with terror. In a hushed tone, I promised to investigate. He gave a small nod, and with a deep breath, I inched forward, my hand trembling as I unzipped the tent just a crack. Peering through the gap, I found the darkness outside impenetrable, the only light source being the faint embers of our extinguished campfire. Squinting, I strained to see beyond the flickering red glow. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I saw a figure near the tree line, a subtle shift in the shadows that seemed to move on silent feet, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving me questioning my tired sanity. Turning back to Jake, I forced a reassuring smile. "Everything's okay, champ. Go back to sleep." Whatever lurked outside wasn't any creature I recognized, and it showed no signs of leaving. As we settled back into our sleeping bags, a sudden noise shattered the silence, jolting me awake. It wasn't the familiar rustle of leaves or the distant hoots of an owl. This was a sharp crack, a deep, resonant snap of a fallen branch, weighty and too close for comfort. A cold sweat instantly coated my skin. Whatever had caused that sound was heavy. Quietly, I rose from my sleeping bag, the tent floor feeling small and exposed beneath me. Retrieving my flashlight, I unzipped the tent fully with deliberate care. The chilly night air rushed in, stealing my breath away momentarily. With trembling hands, I switched on the flashlight and swept its beam across the surrounding woods. The once familiar trees now loomed ominously in the darkness. Shadows danced and twisted in the flickering light, playing tricks on my already rattled mind. I scanned the forest floor for any sign of the creature. A footprint, a snapped twig, but found nothing. Yet just beyond the flashlight's reach, a glimmer caught my eye. A subtle movement, a flash of reflection. I focused the beam in that direction, my heart pounding, but saw only the swaying branches of a nearby pine. Convinced the source of the noise was ahead of me, I had turned away from the tent. However, the sound of leaves crunching behind me shattered that assumption. Rolling around, I aimed the flashlight toward the tent, partially illuminating my son, who sat upright with a confused expression. Whatever had made that noise remained out of sight. I had almost convinced myself it was merely a curious animal, nosing around behind our tent. Just as I was about to dismiss the fear and retreat into the safety of the tent, ready to label the sounds as harmless, the source of the noise revealed itself. A moment that stretched my sanity thin. It stood up from behind the opposite end of the tent, where it had been hiding. It, or me, standing over the tent, partially bathed in the weak glow of my flashlight. It defied all logic and reason, even as I stared directly at it. My mind struggled to accept what my eyes were seeing. It wasn't an animal, as I had initially assumed. It was me. I found myself locked in a gaze with myself. It had my face, but it wasn't me. Its limbs extended from misaligned joints at the shoulders, longer and more spindly than mine. Though humanoid in shape, its proportions were wrong. Its limbs extending at unnatural angles, clad in tattered clothes akin to my camping attire. Its body seemed like a grotesque mirror image of my own. The most unsettling part was its face. It mirrored mine in almost every detail, save for the eyes, voids of absolute blackness, in place of my familiar brown eyes. When caught in the beam of my flashlight, those eyes revealed twin specks of light within the darkness, staring back at me with an unnerving intensity. A single glance revealed its formidable strength, far surpassing my own. Its arms, thick with sinewy muscle, bore the unmistakable markings of a life lived in the wilderness. These were not the sculpted muscles of a gym-goer, but the rugged strength forged by the trials of nature itself. Mountains climbed, rivers crossed, battles waged against the elements. As its mouth contorted grotesquely across its face, the skin splitting like parched earth, a wet tearing filled the night air, an agonizing sound that sent a primal scream echoing through my mind. The chill of the night was now a distant memory, replaced by a fear so profound it threatened to immobilize me. Suddenly, a voice pierced the silence, a small, vulnerable voice belonging to Jake, calling out from within the tent, asking if I could see anything. At the sound of his voice, the creature's attention shifted sharply toward the tent. It leaned in, drawn by Jake's innocence. Its already unnaturally wide mouth stretched further, the lower jaw unhinging to an impossible length, revealing a menacing row of needle-like teeth. The thing raised its elongated arm, which moved unnervingly stiff and jerky, like the movements of someone who hadn't felt flesh beneath their fingertips for years. I could see each joint crackle and pop as it extended its arm. I was confused as to what it was doing, but then realization hit me. Instinct took over. I plunged my hands into the tent, grabbing Jake and yanked him out with all my strength. Yanking him from the tent, we stumbled out, the ground a sickening blur beneath my feet. We landed in a heap, the sound of ripping fabric filling the air as the creature tore through the tent like a child ripping through tissue paper. The metallic tang of blood, sharp and acrid, filled my nostrils. I covered Jake's mouth with my hand, feeling his tears against my skin. We lay there in silence, watching the thing eviscerate our tent. Amidst the chaos, my bag was flung toward us. Recognizing it, I rummaged through it until my fingers closed around the car keys. Leaning close to Jake, I told him when I gave him the signal I wanted him to run for the car. In the tense silence that followed the creature's assault, a distant noise momentarily captured its attention. Seizing the opportunity, I whispered to Jake, "Run!" We sprang up and bolted towards the car, the creature's piercing shriek chasing us from behind. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I pushed on, fueled by a primal urge to protect my son. Reaching the car, I fumbled with the keys, the creature's rasping breaths hot on my neck. With a satisfying click, the door unlocked. We tumbled inside, slamming the door shut just as the creature lunged forward, its fingers scraping against the metal. With trembling hands, I turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life. In the dim light, I could see the creature standing mere inches from the car. Its grotesque smile contorted in what seemed to be frustration. With a surge of adrenaline, I shifted into reverse, then spun the car around, tires churning the earth as we sped down the trail. We didn't stop until we got home. Throughout the drive, Jake remained silent, his soft sobs a stark contrast to my own stifled emotions. That night marked the end of our camping trips. It doesn't look like I'll be beating Daniel on his dad's camping trip anytime soon. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed that story. You can find it linked below. Thank you again to the author for letting me narrate this story. I found it so creepy. I've never been camping myself, and reading stories like this make me even more hesitant to try it. Have you ever been camping? Have you ever had any scary experiences while camping? Leave a comment below. Subscribe for more stories like this, and I will see you next time.